She was just 3, but she helped a German shepherd in need. Their journey is incredible. The sound was barely there, a soft cry, hidden beneath concrete and chaos. What followed was a journey so unbelievable, even those who witnessed it struggled to explain it. This is the kind of story that hurts your heart and then heals it. If you've ever doubted kindness, stay with us. This one's for you. The wind had a bite that afternoon, not the kind that stings, but the kind that whispers quietly through the trees, rustling dead leaves like old secrets trying to be heard. In a quiet neighborhood tucked just beyond the edge of town, the world moved slowly. The sky was pale, like it hadn't quite decided whether to snow or cry. It was the kind of day adults forgot, but children remembered, because something always happened on days like this. Ava was 3. She was the kind of child who didn't just walk. She wandered, as if the air carried stories and her feet chased them. Wrapped in a tiny puffy coat with a red hat that kept slipping over her eyes, she toddled across her grandparents' backyard with the kind of curiosity only the very young or the very old still understood. Her family had brought her over for the weekend. Just another visit, just another afternoon. No one had any reason to expect that this day would be different. The garden behind the house had long since grown tired. What once bloomed with color was now a tangle of vines and leafless shrubs, and at the far edge stood a low, forgotten wall made of crumbling concrete. No one paid it much attention anymore. It was old, ugly, and served no purpose. But to Ava, it was a castle, a hiding place, a mystery waiting to be unwrapped. As she toddled near it, one mitten dragged softly along the cold stone. She hummed to herself, the sound barely louder than the wind. Then she paused, head tilted. Something had whispered back. At first, she thought it was the wind playing a trick. But there it was again, a faint, ragged sound, like something scraping from inside the wall. Not loud, not angry, just desperate. Curious, she leaned closer, her face only inches from the cracked surface. Her tiny hands pressed flat against the concrete as she listened again. And then she saw it. 2 eyes. Not glowing, not fierce, just tired. So deeply tired. Framed by a gap in the wall just wide enough to peer through. Dark brown, almost black, but dulled by exhaustion. Covered in grime, framed by dust and matted fur. It wasn't a monster or a toy. It was something alive. Something that shouldn't have been there. Ava didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stared. The dog didn't move, didn't growl, didn't bark. It blinked once, slow and broken, as if even that effort hurt. They watched each other, the girl and the ghost, neither knowing what came next. Her little hand reached into her coat pocket, fumbling for something, a half-eaten cracker she'd tucked away earlier when no one was looking. She broke off a piece and pushed it gently toward the wall, through the crack. The dog didn't reach for it, but his eyes didn't leave her. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, the kind of understanding too pure to be explained with words. One heart, unscarred and innocent, meeting another that had nearly forgotten what warmth felt like. She stepped back, glanced toward the house, then called out in a voice not panicked, but puzzled, as if she'd simply discovered a new friend in a strange place. "Mommy," she said softly, her mitten pointing toward the crumbling wall. "There's a dog in the wall." The wind carried her words gently across the yard, like they already knew their place in a story that was about to unfold. A story no one would believe at first, and no one would forget. Because she was just 3. But she had found something, or someone, that the world had buried. And nothing from that moment on would ever be the same. The house sat on a quiet street, tucked just beyond the main road where most cars never bothered to turn. It wasn't new nor old enough to be called historic. Just lived in, worn by laughter, softened by memories. The paint was faded on the porch rails, The wind chime on the back patio had long lost its tune, and the grass in the backyard never grew quite right no matter how much sunlight touched it. Behind that house, hidden beyond the short stretch of brittle hedges and the creaky wooden swing, was a part of the yard no one paid much attention to anymore. A narrow patch of land, overgrown, half forgotten, where weeds stretched like bony fingers through cracks in the soil. The once tidy flower beds were buried beneath dry leaves, and vines crawled lazily up the back fence as though time itself had spilled over and taken root. And there, near the far edge of that forgotten corner, stood the wall. It was barely 5 feet high, made of crumbling gray blocks stacked decades ago. No one remembered why it had been built. Some said it was once part of a garden enclosure, others thought it was a leftover structure from when the land had belonged to someone else, long before the family moved in. Whatever its purpose had been, it had lost it long ago. Now it was just there, leaning slightly, cracked in places, dusted with moss. A wall that held nothing, hid nothing, and meant nothing. Or so everyone thought. Inside the house, warmth hummed from a slow-burning fireplace. Ava's grandparents had filled the space with soft colors and soft voices. There were puzzles half-finished on the table, picture books lined on the bottom shelf, and the faint smell of soup simmering in the kitchen. Her mother folded laundry in the hallway, and her father tinkered in the garage, promising he'd fix the old swing one day soon. It was the kind of home where love didn't shout. It just lingered, steady and quiet, like the ticking of a familiar clock. Ava had always been a quiet child, but not in the way that made people worry. She noticed things. Noticed the way light made rainbows in the dish soap. Noticed when someone smiled but their eyes didn't. She spoke in soft tones, asked small questions with big meaning, and listened more than most adults ever did. Her parents often joked she was an old soul, one of those rare children who didn't just see the world, but somehow understood it even when it didn't make sense. That afternoon, as the adults stayed warm inside, Ava bundled herself up, red hat, puffy coat, boots too big but easy to slip on. She pushed open the back door and stepped outside, the chill brushing her cheeks like a quiet dare. She didn't tell anyone she was going. Not out of mischief. Just curiosity. Her tiny feet made soft crunching sounds on the frost-dusted grass as she wandered toward the part of the yard where no one really went. Something about the quiet called her. She didn't hurry. She crouched to touch a curled leaf, paused to look up at the way the bare tree branches reached across the pale sky like long, lonely arms. A bird fluttered somewhere unseen, and Ava tilted her head as if to hear its reason for leaving. And then she saw it. The wall. It had always been there, of course, but today it looked different. Not because of how it stood, but because of how everything else had fallen away. The vines seemed darker against it. The cracks seemed deeper. There was something in the air near it, not heavy, not loud, just waiting. She walked slowly toward it, one mittened hand brushing through the dry overgrowth. There was no fear in her, only wonder, the way children carry it like breath. The wall loomed ahead, chipped and weary. Most of its surface was covered in flaking cement and creeping moss, but near the bottom, just above the soil line, there was a small, strange patch. The cement looked uneven, like someone had smeared over a hole in a hurry. And next to it, just barely visible beneath a tangle of roots and vines, was a gap. Ava crouched, peered in, blinked. Darkness. Silence. Then a sound. Faint, like a whisper trying to crawl its way out of stone. She tilted her head, listening. The world seemed to hold its breath. And though she didn't yet understand what it was she had found, her heart had already made room for it. Ava came back the next morning, just after sunrise, her red wool hat still slipping down over her eyes. The frost hadn't melted from the grass yet, and her breath formed little clouds as she made her way to the far corner of the garden where no one ever went. In her pocket was a slightly crushed cracker she had hidden during breakfast. She hadn't told anyone why she wanted to save it, just that she wasn't hungry, which was a lie. But 3-year-olds don't need reasons they can explain. They just feel and follow. She crouched down at the wall again, her small hands brushing away some of the dead leaves that had gathered overnight. The crack was still there, right at the base, just wide enough to see into if you looked closely, and were quiet enough to let your eyes adjust to the dark. And there they were again, the eyes. Not angry, not wild, just tired, brown so dark they nearly blended with the shadows, and yet they caught the light like they were waiting for something or someone. The dog didn't move. He didn't bark or whimper, but he watched her the same way he had yesterday. No fear, no trust, just stillness. Ava tilted her head slightly, the way small children do when trying to understand something the world hasn't yet explained to them. She didn't know why he was there or how long he had been trapped. She only knew that he didn't belong behind that wall, not like that. Not silent and thin and buried in shadows. She took the cracker from her pocket, broke it into 2 clumsy halves, and gently slid one toward the gap in the cement. The dog didn't reach for it. His body didn't shift, but his eyes followed the cracker, then her. And in that unspoken glance, something passed between them, something delicate and wordless. She didn't need him to bark or lick her hand. She only needed him to see her, and he did. She sat beside the wall for a while, legs crossed in the dirt, coat bunched at her sides, hands resting in her lap. She didn't speak right away. There was no reason to. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was full of questions neither of them knew how to ask. When she did speak, her voice was soft. "Hi, puppy," she said. "Are you hungry?" He didn't respond. Of course not. But his ears flicked just slightly, the kind of movement that barely counts as movement at all. Yet, to Ava, it was everything. "I brought you this," she whispered, nudging the second half of the cracker a bit closer. "It's good. Mommy says it's not, but I like it." The dog's snout twitched, a small puff of breath rising from it, and then stillness again. That night, Ava didn't say much. Her mother noticed she was quieter than usual but chalked it up to the cold. "She's tired," she said to Ava's father as they tucked her in. But Ava wasn't tired. Not really. She was thinking. Not in the way adults think, with logic and lists, but with her heart. Something wasn't right, and she felt it in her chest like a song with no words. The next morning, she went back again. This time with a slice of apple she had hidden beneath her cereal bowl. Her boots made little crunching sounds in the grass, and her scarf trailed behind her like a red ribbon in the wind. She sat by the wall, peeled the apple slowly with her fingers, and laid the pieces near the crack. "You can have some," she said. "I don't mind." Again, the dog didn't eat, but he watched. And when she reached out to gently place one piece even closer, his nose twitched again. And this time, just barely, he stretched his neck an inch forward. Not to eat. Not yet. Just to breathe her in. Ava smiled. It was the first time she smiled during those visits. Over the next few days, she returned again and again, always with something in her pocket. A crust of bread, a soft banana, a tiny chunk of cheese. She brought a small plastic toy once, a faded yellow duck, and set it by the wall. "You can have it," she said. "I've got another one." The dog never touched the toy, but he let it stay. She talked to him. Not like adults do, with instructions or commands. She told him stories. About the rain. About her stuffed elephant. About how she once fell on the kitchen floor and cried until her dad made funny faces. She told him her name, then asked if he had one, then decided to give him one. "I think I'll call you Buddy," she whispered one morning, "because you're my buddy now." That time, when she said the name, the dog's ears lifted just slightly. Not a full perk, just enough to notice. and it made Ava's heart flutter in a way she didn't yet understand, like something invisible had shifted. Each day, Buddy became a little more alive. Not by much, but enough. His eyes blinked more. His breathing grew steadier. He began to shift his weight slightly when she arrived, as if preparing himself to be seen. No one else knew about him. Not yet. Ava kept the secret like children do, not out of mischief, but out of magic. Adults might ruin it, she thought. They might scare him. Or worse, decide he wasn't worth saving. So she came. Every day. Quietly. Gently. Patiently. Because Ava didn't know how to rescue a soul. But her heart did. And behind the wall, Buddy, broken, buried, forgotten, began to feel the faintest flicker of something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Before he became a whisper behind a wall, before his eyes dulled and his body shrank from hunger and time, he had a name. He didn't remember it now, not clearly. It came to him sometimes in dreams, like a sound carried on wind through trees, just out of reach. There had been a time when he wasn't just the dog behind the wall. He had once run freely, powerful and proud, with a coat that shimmered gold in the sun and paws that had never known chains or concrete. His world had been simple: respond when called, sit when ordered, obey without hesitation. And in return, he had a place, a name, a voice that said, "Good boy," now and then, even if it was more habit than affection. He had been trained, not in love, but in obedience. The man who owned him wasn't cruel in the obvious ways. He didn't hit unless provoked. He didn't starve unless he forgot. But he also didn't care. The dog was a tool, not a companion. A presence meant to intimidate others, not comfort them. There were no belly rubs, no walks in the park, no treats handed out for nothing more than a wag of the tail. Everything had a purpose. Even love, if it existed in that house, had terms and conditions. At first, the dog tried to earn it. He followed every order. He stood guard at the door through rain and storm. He barked when strangers passed, even if they meant no harm. But there came a day when his loyalty wasn't enough. Perhaps he got too old, or sick, or simply inconvenient. He remembered the change, subtle at first. Fewer meals. No more fresh water. The backyard gate left open, as if someone hoped he might wander off and solve the problem himself. But he didn't. He stayed. Dogs do that. Even when love has vanished, they cling to duty. And then one day there was construction. A renovation project, or maybe something larger. Workers came and went. Walls were torn down. New ones were raised. Dust filled the air. Noise replaced silence. The man barely acknowledged the dog now. He shouted once, a sharp, annoyed, "Get out of the way." And that was the last time the dog heard his voice. He remembered trying to follow the man into the newly built space, a back extension behind the house, still half-finished, with walls not yet sealed and tools scattered across the floor. He was curious, or maybe just lonely. He stepped inside, tail low, head tilted. Then the door closed behind him. Not slammed, not locked with purpose, just closed. And then, forgotten. The space wasn't meant to trap him. Not at first. It was just a mistake. A forgotten corner. A silent oversight. But days passed and no one came back. The door was sealed shut with fresh panels. The cracks in the wall, small enough to miss, large enough to breathe through, were filled, patched, then forgotten again. Somewhere between carelessness and cruelty, he was left there. Abandoned not with violence, but with indifference. Time lost its meaning. The food he had in his stomach ran out within days. The thirst came faster. At first he barked. He scratched the wall. He cried, a sound raw and rising from a place no creature should ever have to reach. But no one heard, or no one cared. He began to shrink, not just in body, but in spirit. The silence became heavier than the hunger. His muscles weakened, his fur matted with dust and blood from clawing at the stone. The light that filtered through the crack was the only reminder that a world still existed outside. And slowly, painfully, he began to forget. He forgot what grass felt like, what wind smelled like, what joy was. He forgot his name. His trust fractured first, then hope, then everything else. By the time Ava found him, he was no longer the dog he had once been. He wasn't guard, or pet, or good boy. He was a ghost with lungs, a heartbeat waiting to stop, a memory that hadn't finished being made. His world was a box made of cement and regret, and he had made peace with the idea that no one was coming. So when she appeared, small, bright, unafraid, and slid a cracker toward him with hands too new to understand cruelty, something inside him stirred. Not belief, not yet, but confusion, wonder, a flicker of why. Because in his world, kindness had no place. Not anymore. That's why he didn't eat. That's why he didn't bark or wag or move. He didn't trust it. He couldn't. But every day she came. And every day the wall between them, the real one, not just made of stone, began to thin. Just a little. Hope, once sealed away, has a way of finding cracks. She came every day now, as if her little legs knew the path by heart. The frost still sat on the grass in the early mornings, but she never minded the cold. Her red mittens clutched bits of food carefully chosen from breakfast. A crust of toast, a slice of apple, one time even a bite of banana she had hidden when no one was looking. The adults thought she was simply wandering, like children do. But Ava wasn't just playing in the backyard anymore. She was returning to someone. Behind the garden, where the forgotten wall stood covered in vines and silence, her secret waited. The dog was still there, still thin and still quiet. His eyes didn't follow her with fear anymore. There was something else in them now, something softer, something that hadn't existed the first time they met. He didn't bark, didn't whimper. But every time she came, he watched her. And to Ava, that was enough. She would crouch beside the crack in the wall, gently place the food near it, and then sit cross-legged in the dirt like she was settling in beside a friend. She talked to him sometimes, her voice barely louder than the breeze. She told him what she dreamed about. She told him when the soup was too hot. She told him about her stuffed elephant, about how her dad made funny faces when she cried, and about how her grandma always forgot where she left her glasses. The dog never answered, of course, but that didn't matter. He listened. His ears would twitch at certain words, or he would blink slow and long like he understood. One day, Ava brought something more than food. It was a tiny square of an old baby blanket, soft and pale blue, folded twice to fit in her coat pocket. She pressed it through the crack, trying her best to tuck it close to the dog's paws. "So you're not cold," she whispered, brushing her mitten against the stone as if it were his fur. He didn't move, but he didn't pull away either. That night, she couldn't sleep, thinking about whether he was using it. Each day, he began to shift closer to her, never quickly, never far. Just inches. A little more each time. One afternoon, she found him with his nose nearly at the opening. His head was lower, relaxed, not tight with fear. And for the first time, he sniffed the bread before she walked away. Her heart fluttered in her chest, too full for words. She didn't say anything, just smiled and sat a little closer. That evening at bedtime, she whispered into the dark, "I think his name is Buddy." No one heard. But that didn't matter either. It was the first name that had felt right. Not from a list or a book, but from her heart. She'd thought about it all day. Buddy. Because that's what he was. Not a pet. Not a project. A friend. The next day, she said it out loud. "Hi, Buddy." She crouched beside the wall and placed his food down slowly. "I brought your favorite today. It's peanut butter toast." The dog didn't flinch. Didn't retreat. His ears twitched, then lifted, just slightly, and his eyes met hers for a long moment. That was the first time she truly felt seen. Not just looked at. She didn't cheer, didn't call out to anyone. This moment wasn't for the world. It was just theirs. Later that week, she brought a toy. It was small, a yellow stuffed duck with a missing eye, one she hadn't played with in months but had never quite let go of. She set it down beside the food. "You can have him," she said gently. "He's not scared of the dark anymore." The dog didn't take it, but he let it stay, tucked beneath the corner of his blanket like a silent thank you. One afternoon, she reached her hand a little closer than usual, palm flat against the cold earth. He hesitated, then inched forward until his nose brushed the tips of her fingers. Just once. Just enough. Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't move. Her hand stayed still, heart pounding, eyes wide. That night, she didn't tell anyone. But she smiled in her sleep. To Ava, Buddy was no longer a dog in a wall. He was someone. Someone who mattered. Someone who needed her. She didn't think of herself as brave. She didn't think of what she was doing as rescue. She just knew she had to keep coming. She had to show him, day after day, that he wasn't forgotten, that he wasn't alone. And so, she kept showing up. With her breadcrumbs and her stories, with her songs and her secrets. And the dog who had once curled into himself like a shadow now lifted his head when he heard her voice. She had no idea how much she was changing him, how her quiet kindness was pulling him, inch by inch, back into the world. She only knew one thing. She wouldn't stop. Not until Buddy believed it too. Ava had never been one to wander too far. Her world was usually small. The kitchen, the swing set, the soft rug where she built block towers only to knock them down with laughter. But lately there was a shift, subtle at first. Her jacket, once tossed on the floor after playtime, stayed zipped longer. Her shoes were always a little muddy, and bits of leaves clung to the hem of her coat. She had begun to disappear into the backyard with quiet purpose, always carrying something small in her hand, returning with dirt-streaked cheeks and a calm in her eyes that no one quite understood. Her parents watched her from the window more often now. They didn't interrupt, not yet. Children wandered. It was what they did. But even her grandmother, who had raised 3 of her own, began to feel something uneasy settle in her chest. Ava wasn't just playing anymore. She was tending to something. It was the day before the storm when they followed her. Her mother watched the way her daughter's little boots stepped carefully along the worn path behind the hedges, not running, not skipping, just walking steadily like someone returning to a promise. Her father slipped on his jacket without saying a word, motioning silently for his wife and mother to follow. They moved slowly, careful not to let Ava hear the crunch of their steps across the frost-hardened grass. She was already near the far end of the yard when they caught up, kneeling beside that old stone wall no one had paid attention to in years, the one wrapped in vines and shadow. And then they saw what she had been seeing all along. A crack not wider than a hand, barely noticeable behind the tangle of weeds, but enough to peer through. Behind it ice, dull and hollow, framed by the sharp edges of a gaunt face barely poking through the wall. A dog? No, not just a dog. A ghost of one. He didn't snarl. He didn't cry. He only watched them, breath shallow, ribs showing through matted fur, a blanket half covered in dirt pulled close to his chest like something sacred. Ava was speaking to him, softly, one hand resting near the wall. She placed a small piece of bread beside the opening, tucking it carefully under a vine, as if she had done it 100 times before. The adult stood frozen. Her mother's heart clenched in her throat, horror blooming inside her chest as she realized what she was looking at. A dog. Starving. Forgotten. Right there in the backyard. Her father moved first, stepping beside Ava, crouching to see if what he was seeing was real. His face went pale. His breath caught. The wall wasn't just hiding the dog, it had swallowed him whole. The structure looked old, maybe part of some unfinished renovation. Someone long ago had sealed it off without checking twice. And inside, life had been left behind. Ava turned to them with a smile, proud and completely unaware of their shock. She said the dog's name was Buddy, that she had been helping him, that he liked toast and didn't mind the cold as much now that he had a blanket. Her words were innocent, but they landed like stones in their chests. The grandmother dropped to her knees, her hand trembling as she reached toward the opening. The dog didn't growl. He simply blinked, too tired to be afraid anymore. It was the guilt that hit next. A tidal wave of it. This wasn't a stranger's house. This was their yard, their wall. And somehow, they had walked past it again and again, never once seeing what had been there all along. They hadn't heard the scratching. They hadn't noticed the food disappearing from the kitchen. Only Ava had. A child, 3 years old, with no tools, no voice of authority, just a heart that refused to walk away from suffering. No one spoke for several seconds. Her father stood slowly, eyes still fixed on the crack in the wall. His jaw was tight, fists clenched at his sides. Her mother pulled Ava gently into her arms, pressing her lips to her forehead. The child looked up, confused. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had simply kept showing up. She had done what love does when it doesn't need to be told how. "We're getting him out," her father said, the words falling like a promise into the cold air. No one questioned it. No one hesitated. The silence broke into action. They moved quickly, gathering flashlights, gloves, and old towels from the shed. Her grandfather returned with tools, the kind used for breaking brick. Her grandmother found an old heating pad they once used for sore backs. Ava stayed close to the wall, whispering softly, telling Buddy that help was finally here, that she knew they would come, that he didn't have to be alone anymore. As they worked, the dog didn't try to escape. He didn't bark or flinch. He only watched Ava, eyes following her every move, as if she was the only part of the world that still made sense. Piece by piece, they began chipping at the wall, not enough to scare him, just enough to see more of the life hidden beneath. And as the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting a golden light across the broken vines and dust, something else became clear too. They hadn't just found a dog in that wall. They had found what they had all forgotten, what compassion looks like when it has no agenda, what love looks like when it's lived through the hands of a child. And as the cold settled in and the tools kept working and the wall gave way, one small truth burned quietly inside every one of them. Ava hadn't just saved him. She had reminded them all how to feel again. The wall was colder than they expected. When her father touched it with his bare hands, the chill clung to his skin like the memory of everything that had gone wrong there. Cement didn't care about time, didn't care about the lives pressed against it. But now they did. He ran his fingers along the uneven surface, stopping where the crack had been widened just enough to see the shape of the dog inside. Buddy didn't move when they arrived that morning. He was still awake, his breathing shallow, the faint rise and fall of his chest barely visible through the dim light. Ava was already sitting beside him, as she always did, whispering quietly into the space between them like she was telling him a secret. Her little mitten rested gently on the stone. She didn't cry. She just waited. They had called animal control first, thinking surely this was something trained hands should handle. But the line was long, the response slow, and the urgency was theirs alone. A case number was logged. A promise to send someone out when a team becomes available was made. But that wasn't soon enough. Not for a dog who had waited this long. Not for a little girl who had waited beside him. So the family decided they would begin. Her father brought out a small chisel and a hammer, tools that had spent most of their lives in a drawer untouched. He tested the stone, tapping gently, making sure the vibrations wouldn't frighten the animal trapped inside. Her grandfather stood beside him with a flashlight, steadying the beam toward the weakest section of the wall, the part that looked like it had been patched in a hurry decades ago. Her mother placed a blanket on the ground, just behind Ava, in case the moment came quickly and they needed a soft space to lay him down. Buddy didn't bark. He didn't growl. He only watched them with eyes that looked too tired to hope, but not quite empty enough to give up. Word spread quickly. A neighbor peered over the fence, saw the commotion, and came closer. Then another. A few minutes later, someone brought a crowbar. Someone else brought bottled water and a space heater. No one asked questions. They just showed up. By the end of the hour, there were nearly a dozen people in that backyard, wrapped in coats and scarves, kneeling in the dirt with the kind of unity that only happens when hearts are broken open all at once. The sound of chipping cement filled the cold air. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, a rhythm of rescue, one strike at a time. Bits of dust and old mortar flaked away, and the gap began to grow. Enough to see more of him now. His front legs curled tight, his shoulders hunched, his body wedged into a space no living thing should ever have been forced to occupy. His fur was matted with grime, his paws cracked and raw. Yet still he did not move, as if he had forgotten how, as if moving would wake him from a dream he no longer dared believe was real. Ava sat quietly the entire time. She didn't squirm or complain about the cold. She didn't ask how long it would take. She just stayed right there, close enough for Buddy to see her, to smell her, to remember who had been there when no one else was. Her tiny fingers curled around her duck toy, the one she had given him days ago, its one remaining eye now coated in dust. She kept whispering. No one else could hear what she said, but whatever it was, it mattered. Because every time she spoke, Buddy blinked a little slower, breathed a little deeper, as if her words carried the only warmth he trusted. When the stone finally cracked, it didn't fall all at once. Just a piece. Then another. Enough to make space. Enough to let light in where there had been none. Her father dropped the hammer and reached through the opening with cautious hands. He didn't touch Buddy. Not yet. He just opened the space wider, whispering gently, letting the dog decide. Everyone fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. And then, slowly, painfully slowly, Buddy shifted. First a paw. Then his head, lowered almost to the ground, dragging forward with trembling effort. Every movement was a question. Is this real? Is it safe? Am I allowed to leave? Ava didn't move, but she opened her arms just slightly, not wide, not dramatic, just enough. And that's when it happened. Buddy, with legs too weak to stand, stumbled forward out of the hole that had been his prison. He didn't collapse. He didn't run. He didn't even look around. He simply crawled, dragging himself inch by inch toward her lap, and rested his head there as gently as a falling leaf. The sound that came from the crowd was not a cheer. It was softer. A single exhale shared between strangers, the kind of sound that belongs to the sacred spaces between relief and grief. Ava looked down, her hands resting on his head, brushing gently over the curve of his ears. She smiled, not a big one, not loud or full of celebration. Just a quiet smile, like a promise had been kept. No one said anything for a while. Her father sat down beside her, then her mother, then the others, forming a silent circle around the child and the dog who had found each other through a wall no one else had noticed. The sun had begun to dip behind the trees, casting golden light through the cold branches, painting their small scene in warmth. And in that fading hour, something changed, not just for Buddy, not just for Ava, but for everyone who had watched. They had seen love that asked for nothing, kindness that didn't come from orders or instructions. A child had led them here, one step at a time. And now, finally, the wall was gone. They wrapped him in a blanket that smelled like home, though he had never known what that meant. His body, limp and barely responsive, was lifted into the back seat with hands that trembled from something deeper than cold. Ava sat beside him the whole way, her small hand resting on his paw, whispering words only he could hear. The car moved gently over the bumps in the road, but every shift made him flinch. Not from pain alone, but from memory. The animal clinic was quiet when they arrived, the lights humming low against the walls. The vet had seen rescues before. Dogs left behind. Dogs abused. But something about this one made her pause longer than usual. Maybe it was the weight of the silence in the room. Or maybe it was the way Ava refused to let go of his paw until they wheeled him away. He had no name in their records. No tag. No chip. Just a thin file with words like critical, dehydrated, malnourished, and open lesions. His ribs were broken. His breathing shallow. Infection had spread across his skin in patches where fur had long since disappeared. One of his paws was twisted unnaturally, an old injury that had never healed properly. They placed him under warming lights, connected him to 4 fluids, and hoped. But no one said it out loud. The vet looked at Ava's parents with the kind of practiced sympathy that always comes before hard truths. She told them his chances were slim, that he might not make it through the night, that sometimes, when dogs are this far gone, their bodies give up before their hearts do. Ava listened quietly, her feet dangling from the chair in the corner, her eyes wide but dry. She didn't ask if he would die. She simply said, "I want to come back tomorrow." And she did. Every day, sometimes twice. She sat by his kennel with drawings she had made, crayon sketches of him standing in a field, or sleeping in a warm bed, or playing with a yellow duck. She sang quietly under her breath, sometimes lullabies her mother had taught her, other times songs she made up on the spot, just for him. The clinic staff started to notice. They began scheduling his checkups around Ava's visits. Nurses would gently nudge his body into a better position when they knew she was coming, just so he could see her when he opened his eyes. At first, he didn't move. His gaze would flick toward her, then away. The trauma was still too thick, still fresh beneath his skin. Some nights, he trembled in his sleep. His legs twitched as if running from something. His breath would hitch and a low whimper would escape his throat. No one knew what he had seen behind that wall. But the silence that lived inside him spoke volumes. There were moments when the staff believed the vet might be right, that he would drift slowly, peacefully, until his heart surrendered. But then Ava would arrive, and something would shift. His ears would lift. His tail, limp and useless for days, would twitch, once, then again. The smallest movements, but in a dog so close to the edge, they were everything. One morning, nearly 2 weeks after the rescue, she brought him a new blanket. Bright blue, covered in tiny white stars. Her grandmother had sewn it for him, just the right size for his kennel. Ava folded it herself, laid it down gently, and whispered, "So you can dream better now." Later that night, the vet found him sleeping more peacefully than ever before, his nose buried in the fabric, his body no longer curled in defense but stretched out, vulnerable. Trusting. The healing was slow. His wounds closed inch by inch, with each shift in his diet, with every round of antibiotics. His coat began to soften, just a little, and the dullness in his eyes gave way to something steadier. He still flinched at loud sounds, still looked over his shoulder when someone walked behind him, but he let them touch him now. He let them clean him without baring his teeth. Most of all, he let Ava sit by him without shrinking away. Every visit brought a new story. She told him how the swing had been fixed in the backyard, how the duck toy was waiting for him at home, how her mom had bought him a bowl with his name on it, Buddy, in big blue letters. She spoke about the future with the kind of certainty only a child can hold, and somehow he believed her. Not because of what she said, but because she kept showing up. The vet began to believe too. The X-rays looked better. The fluid levels steadied. He had even begun to eat on his own, slow and clumsy, but enough to give everyone hope. There were still bad days. Days when he barely lifted his head, when the pain in his old injuries flared, or when a sudden noise sent him back into himself. But then Ava would return, sit quietly beside him, and everything softened again. One afternoon, the vet caught something she hadn't expected to see: Buddy lifting his head before Ava even entered the room. As if he knew. As if her footsteps were etched into his memory now, the rhythm of her arrival more powerful than pain. When she came in, he didn't just watch her. He reached out, slowly, placing one paw toward the front of the kennel, as if asking her to stay just a little longer. She did. And in the stillness of that room, surrounded by the hum of machines and the quiet breath of second chances, a dog who had once been forgotten began to remember who he was. Not a guard, not a victim, not a mistake, just Buddy. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't surviving because someone demanded it. He was healing because someone loved him. The house felt different with him in it. Not louder, not busier, just more alive. As if the walls themselves had exhaled after holding their breath for far too long. Buddy didn't move much in those first days at home. He stayed mostly in the living room corner, where a soft bed had been laid for him beside the heater. The family had placed it there gently, with blankets that smelled like safety and a bowl of water that was always full. The front door stayed shut more than usual. Shoes were taken off quietly. No one vacuumed. The world was kept small for him, as if the whole house had agreed to whisper while he healed. Buddy didn't bark. He didn't growl. But he flinched at everything. A dropped spoon. A door creaking open. The sound of the kettle whistling. His eyes would dart to the nearest exit, but he never ran. Instead, he froze, waiting for something bad to follow. Nothing ever did. Still, it took time for him to believe it. He didn't trust doorways. He avoided thresholds like they were traps. Whenever someone passed too close, he'd shrink into himself, head low, body tight. Sometimes he would stare at the wall and tremble, just for a few seconds, like his memories still echoed there. At night, the family could hear him moving in his sleep, paws twitching against the blankets, a low, muffled whine escaping from deep in his chest. But Ava never left his side. She sat with him while he napped. She read books aloud in a soft, steady voice, even if he didn't seem to be listening. She brought him toys, placed gently in front of him, never pushing. She didn't try to hug him or pet him too much. She just let him be. And slowly, something began to shift. The first time he wagged his tail, it was barely noticeable. Just a twitch. Ava had walked in from the kitchen carrying a slice of apple, and Buddy, watching from his bed, had moved his tail once. She saw it. She didn't cheer. She didn't run to tell anyone. She just knelt beside him and offered the apple like she always did. But this time, his nose met her hand before she even called his name. Then came the bowl. He had eaten before, of course, when no one was looking, when the house was still. But this time, he approached his dish in the middle of the day, with Ava sitting nearby and sunlight pouring through the windows. He sniffed, looked at her, then slowly began to eat. Not frantically, not like the food would disappear, but calmly, like he had permission now. Her mother watched from the kitchen, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. They weren't from sadness. They were from awe. Because recovery didn't always announce itself in grand gestures. Sometimes, it looked like a dog chewing slowly in a quiet room while a little girl hummed softly beside him. There were setbacks too. Once, during a thunderstorm, Buddy disappeared. They searched every room, only to find him in the laundry closet, wedged behind a basket, his eyes wild and distant. Ava didn't speak when they found him. She just crawled into the space beside him, curled her small body around his, and stayed until the storm passed. That night, she made a decision no one questioned. She brought her pillow into the living room, dragged a spare blanket from the hall closet, and laid down beside his bed. He didn't move at first, unsure of what she was doing. But sometime in the early hours, when the house had gone completely still, he lifted his head, shuffled closer, and rested it gently beside hers. Her father found them like that in the morning. He stood in the doorway for a long time, not saying a word, just watching the girl and the dog who had built something stronger than memory, something made from patience and presence and quiet understanding. Days turned into weeks. Buddy followed Ava through the house now. Not close enough to trip over, but always near. If she left a room, he waited by the door. If she sat on the rug to play, he lay just a few feet away, watching. He still had scars inside and out. Some wounds would never fade entirely. But the house was no longer a place he feared. It was home. The family didn't speak about the change as much as they felt it. The way they paused more often. The way they softened their voices when entering a room. Even the way they looked at Ava, not with surprise anymore, but with something like reverence. Because it had been her from the beginning. Her kindness. Her presence. Her refusal to look away from something broken. And Buddy, who had once hidden behind stone and silence, now greeted the morning with steady breath and watchful eyes. He was still learning, still healing, but he had begun to trust again. Not because anyone forced him to, because one small girl had waited long enough for him to believe it was safe. It began with a photo. Nothing posed or edited, no filters or careful angles. Just Ava, sitting on the floor in her pajamas, her hair tangled from sleep, one arm draped gently over the sleeping dog beside her. The morning light poured in through the curtains, catching the soft rise and fall of Buddy's chest as he lay curled against her like he'd always belonged there. Her mother had stood in the hallway, phone in hand, and snapped the picture without thinking. Not to share, just to remember. Later that night, when the house had gone still, she stared at that photo. There was something in it, something raw and quiet and undeniable. Not just the dog, not just her daughter, but what they had become together. Against every odd, despite everything, they had found each other. She opened her laptop. She wrote a few words, just enough to tell the truth. No dramatics, no begging for attention. Just the facts. A dog was found trapped inside a wall. A 3-year-old girl helped save him. They're healing now, together. She posted the photo and went to bed. By morning, her inbox was full. The image had traveled faster than she could have imagined. One share turned into hundreds, then thousands. News outlets reached out. Rescue organizations asked to repost. Animal lovers left comments from all over the country, New York, Texas, Ohio, small towns and big cities alike. There were stories from nurses, teachers, veterans, strangers who said they cried when they read about Ava and Buddy. People sent letters, packages. Some arrived with toys, others with dog treats and blankets and hand-knitted scarves. One box came with a single sentence written on the inside flap. This story reminded me what love looks like. The front porch became a collection point for kindness. Neighbors dropped off bags of kibble. A local pet store donated medical supplies. Children from a nearby school sent drawings, stick figure versions of Ava and Buddy under rainbows and sunshine, always smiling. Ava didn't understand the full reach of it at first. She only knew that more people were waving from the sidewalk, and that Buddy's treat bowl never stayed empty for long. A small local newspaper ran the headline first, "Girl, 3, rescues dog trapped in wall, teaches town what compassion means." It was picked up by a regional site the next day, and within a week, a national morning show mentioned it during their feel-good segment. The photo flashed across televisions, websites, and social media feeds. A little girl and a broken dog resting in the calm after the storm. But Ava didn't care about any of that. The cameras didn't matter. The stories didn't change how she looked at Buddy. To her, he was still just her friend, the one who needed her, the one who now followed her from room to room and curled beside her at night like a promise. If she noticed the reporters outside or the deliveries piling up, she never let it distract her. Her focus was always on him. And because of that, the world didn't just see a rescue story. They saw something deeper. They saw a child who hadn't looked away from suffering, who had, in the quietest way possible, reminded everyone that empathy doesn't require age or instruction. Just presence. Just willingness. Her story didn't shout. It whispered. And somehow that made it ring louder. Her mother kept the internet at arm's length. She filtered the messages, chose carefully what to share. She made sure that the attention never overwhelmed the reason it existed. But she couldn't deny the beauty in what had begun to unfold, a wave of goodness sparked not by performance, but by one honest act of love. One evening, as Ava sat with Buddy beneath a blanket in the living room, her father scrolled through the hundreds of messages people had sent. One line stood out, and he read it aloud, more to himself than anyone else. "This little girl is who I want to be when I grow up." No one responded, but Ava leaned her head against Buddy's shoulder, and the dog let out a long, contented sigh, as if he already knew. What started in silence, a forgotten wall, a hidden life, had become something much louder. But not because they had tried to make it loud. It had grown because the world was starving for something real. And in a world too often shaped by noise and cruelty, a small girl with soft hands and patient eyes had reminded them all that sometimes healing begins with a whisper. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning. No one was expecting it. The skies were overcast, the kitchen smelled like cinnamon toast, and Buddy had been dozing by the window while Ava built a fort out of couch cushions and blankets. Her mother stood a few feet away, phone in hand, not recording anything in particular, just another ordinary morning with her daughter and the dog who had become a heartbeat in their home. She wasn't expecting anything magical. She just wanted to remember how peaceful they looked together. Ava had leaned in close to whisper something, some secret only Buddy was allowed to hear. He turned his head, slow and deliberate, and for the first time, with no hesitation, no flicker of fear, he licked her cheek. Just once. Soft, careful and sure. She giggled, a real, belly-deep giggle, and wrapped her arms around his neck without thinking, burying her face into his fur. He didn't pull away. He didn't flinch. He just let her hold him. The moment lasted no more than a few seconds. A blink in time. But her mother caught it. Every frame. The way Buddy's eyes had softened. The way Ava's face lit up like the world had just given her a secret gift. It was more than affection. It was trust. It was healing. It was everything this journey had been about, captured in a gesture so gentle it could only have come from love. That night, after Ava was tucked into bed and Buddy was curled on the rug nearby, her mother uploaded the clip. No captions, no hashtags, just the raw video. She had debated whether to share it at all, wondering if it would turn something sacred into something consumed. But the world had already found them. And something about this particular moment, this small, perfect breakthrough, felt like it belonged to more than just their family. The clip exploded. It started with a few hundred shares. A comment here, a repost there. And then the numbers swelled. Tens of thousands of views. Then hundreds of thousands. Within 48 hours, the video had passed 1 million. People from across the globe, parents, dog lovers, rescue advocates, even celebrities, shared the video with captions like, "This is what hope looks like," and "The kindest thing I've seen all year." News stations picked it up next. Headlines filled screens across the country. From trapped to treasured, dog who lived in a wall finds a best friend in a 3-year-old girl. Ava's mother began getting interview requests, voicemail messages, Producers asking for follow-up footage. A national morning show ran the story with soft piano music playing under the clip, the hosts dabbing their eyes, smiling through their tears. For a brief moment in a chaotic world, the story of a little girl and her rescued dog became a shared breath of peace. But inside the house, nothing changed. Ava didn't care about views or stories or people crying on TV. She still crawled across the floor on all fours, pretending to be a puppy while Buddy followed behind her with his slow, careful steps. She still asked if Buddy could have his own plate at dinner, even though he already had his bowl. She still whispered bedtime stories into his fur before falling asleep beside him, tangled in blankets and the unbreakable safety of routine. When the family told her about the video going viral, she blinked and said, "Did Buddy like it?" That was all that mattered. To her, the rest of the world didn't exist. There were no cameras in her eyes, no applause in her voice. Just her and her friend, side by side in a world they were still learning to trust. Fame never touched her. It floated above, around, behind, but never inside. Because her love had never been for show. It had been instinct. Pure presence. Buddy didn't understand the screens or the people waving when they walked down the street. But he understood her. Her voice. Her smell. The way she moved slowly now, giving him time. The way her fingers brushed past his scars like they weren't even there. And that was enough. Sometimes, when the house quieted again and the news trucks had left and the mail slowed down, Ava's father would watch the video one more time before bed. Not because he wanted to relive the moment, but because he needed to remind himself that even in the smallest gestures, the world can be changed. All it took was one child who didn't walk away, and one dog who found the strength to believe again. The front porch no longer held just packages and well wishes. It became a place where people left stories. Handwritten notes tucked between leashes and blankets. Folded drawings from children who had never met Ava but felt like they knew her. There was one envelope, taped gently to a small box of dog biscuits, that read, "We rescued our first senior dog today, because of you." Another arrived with a photograph of a scared-eyed pup wrapped in a towel and the words, "We saw Buddy's story. Now we're writing our own." The family didn't set out to start anything big. They had never imagined themselves as organizers or activists. But something had shifted since that day behind the wall. A new kind of urgency had settled in their bones, not the panicked kind, but the purposeful kind. Quiet, determined, and rooted in knowing what it meant to see suffering and not turn away. It started with a single post on a local forum, looking to foster injured or abandoned animals. "We've got space and we've got love." The response came fast. A few calls, then more. Within a month, 3 dogs had passed through their care, each with their own scars, their own silences. Some stayed for days, others for weeks. All left better than they came. Ava didn't treat any of them like projects or guests. She greeted each one like a friend. She gave them names the way a gardener gives names to flowers, with tenderness and imagination. Buddy watched them all from his spot by the window or the corner of the living room, his body once tense at the presence of strangers, now calm. Still cautious, but curious. He didn't hide anymore. He walked the hallways slowly, padding beside Ava when she moved from room to room, sometimes nudging a foster dog with his nose, as if to say, "It's okay here. You're safe now." One of the rescues was a limping terrier with half a tail and a history no one fully knew. Ava called her Pebble. On her second night in the house, Pebble cried in her sleep. Not loudly, just small, choked sounds that made the room feel too big. Ava woke up, shuffled out of her bed, and lay beside her on the floor. Buddy followed moments later, curled up on the other side, and the 3 of them lay like that in a little crescent of comfort until morning. The house changed, slowly and sweetly. There were more bowls in the kitchen, more chew toys scattered on the rug. But the biggest change couldn't be measured in objects. It was in how people moved, how they listened, how they looked at each other and asked, "What do you need?" and really meant it. Buddy, once broken by silence, began to find his voice again, not through barking, but through presence. He learned to walk with Ava down the street, his steps light but steady. He stopped flinching at screen doors. He let strangers pet him, gently at first, then with ease. The vet who once doubted he'd survive now knelt beside him in the exam room, scratching behind his ears with a smile. "You're a miracle, aren't you?" she whispered once. Buddy didn't wag his tail. He simply leaned into her hand, eyes soft, still and sure. And all the while, Ava grew too. Not louder, not bolder, but deeper. She began to understand what it meant to hold space for pain without trying to fix it all at once. She knew when to speak and when to simply sit beside something hurting until it felt safe enough to heal. Adults came and went with donations, offers, thank you letters. But it was Ava's quiet presence that steadied the house. She didn't try to be anyone's hero. She just kept showing up. People started to refer to their little family as the rescue house. A term that made them smile, not because of pride, but because it felt true. Not just for the animals, but for themselves. Everyone in that house had been rescued in some way. Pulled out of grief, out of numbness, out of routines that had forgotten how to pause and feel. Buddy's healing had cracked something open in all of them, and through it, they'd built a life they never saw coming. There were still hard days. Foster dogs that arrived too frightened to eat. Nights when memories stirred and Buddy needed the soft press of Ava's hand to calm the ghosts in his sleep. But there was a rhythm now. A kind of trust that life, though messy and often unfair, could also be beautiful again, if tended to carefully. One evening, after the dishes were done and the sky had turned soft and gray, Ava sat on the porch with Buddy beside her. He was older now, moving slower, but his eyes were bright. She leaned against him, a storybook in her lap, and read aloud with all the intention of someone who knew every word mattered. He listened, not because he understood the plot, but because he understood her. The story had started with a wall, with a cry no one heard, except one little girl. And now the world was hearing it, not through noise, not through fame, but through every life that had been touched by a dog who had learned to trust again, and the child who had waited for him to try. Time, as it always does, moved on. The seasons shifted. Leaves fell. Snow came and melted. Grass grew in patches that Buddy liked to roll in, even when his legs got stiff. Ava grew taller, her voice stronger, her laugh deeper, but something in her never changed. Not the way she walked beside him. Not the way she still looked for him first thing every morning, as if she needed to make sure he was still real, still hers. Their bond was no longer just storybook sweet. It was lived in, rooted, as natural as breath. Buddy followed her through every hallway like he had since the beginning, not because he was afraid, but because he simply wanted to be where she was. And Ava, still young but wiser than most ever get to be, carried him in her heart like a promise she'd made before she even knew what a promise was. There were nights the family would sit around the living room, quietly watching the two of them do something small, Ava brushing Buddy's fur while humming, or Buddy resting his head on her feet as she colored. And someone, always softly, would say it again. Can you believe this all started with a wall? It never stopped feeling like a miracle. Not just because Buddy had survived, but because Ava had known what to do when no one else did. She hadn't needed words. She hadn't needed instructions. She'd heard something no one else had, not with her ears, but with her heart. And what she gave, day after day, wasn't loud or flashy. It was something quieter, rare, presence. Patience. The kind of kindness that doesn't come from learning, but from simply being born that way. Her first words to him were never forgotten. Not by her parents. Not by the neighbors. Not by anyone who had followed the story as it unfolded across the internet and television screens. But most importantly, not by Buddy. You're not alone. She had said it like it was the most natural thing in the world, crouched beside a crack in the wall, offering her hand to something that was more shadow than shape. And somehow, even then, he had believed her. Now, years later, when her voice had changed and her shoes had grown and her drawings had turned to real writing, that simple sentence still echoed in every touch, every glance, every quiet afternoon spent side by side. They had been through so much together. From those broken first days in the vet's office, to the viral video, to the fosters that came and went, dogs that trembled and healed, thanks to Ava and Buddy's silent lessons in trust. And through it all, their love had never needed much. A blanket, a story, a place to rest, and the knowledge that whatever had once hurt them was far behind now, softened by time and tenderness. On the last page of the family's photo album, the one filled with snapshots of Buddy's recovery and Ava's growing smile, there was a picture. It wasn't staged, just another moment caught in the right light. Ava and Buddy walking away from the camera, the sun stretched long across the backyard, her hand resting gently on his back, his body leaning just slightly into her side. No words, no waves, just the two of them disappearing into the horizon like a story that didn't end, only changed shape. And maybe that's how all the best stories go. Not with fireworks or grand declarations, but with quiet loyalty, with soft footsteps, with a girl who listened when no one else did, and a dog who lived because she believed he could. In a world that so often rushes past the broken, that forgets to slow down long enough to see, Ava had stopped. At just 3 years old, she had offered love without condition. Not for applause, not for recognition, just because something inside her knew the truth. Sometimes, the smallest hands carry the biggest hearts. Sometimes, love doesn't need to be explained, only lived. And sometimes, a child's whisper in the dark can save a soul from disappearing. She was just 3, but she had the heart of a giant. Sometimes, the most profound connections are the ones we can't explain. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe to continue exploring the mysteries of life. Until then, remember, there's magic in the unknown.